Hey folks, Double Click is a channel that I've started, which is my attempt at understanding the policy architecture. It is the musings of a self-confessed policy monk who hopes that this channel serves as a guide for policymakers and enthusiasts alike. What I am hoping to do with the channel is to be able to use first principles to understand and look at our policy problems a lot more closely, and while doing so, potentially suggest solutions to improve the same. The aim of the channel is to ensure that we understand policy holistically so that we can achieve the vision of a Viksit Bharat by 2047. In other words, it will take a look at what needs to be done in order to ensure that we indeed, as a nation, make our tryst with destiny. The question that you may have is why now? Well, it is the election season. We've just completed phase 3 and we'll have phase 4 on May 13th. Elections are an exercise wherein we as citizens elect our representatives to parliament. And it is these representatives based on which party they represent and who forms a majority that forms the government. The government is at the forefront of making all policy decisions that would ensure we move towards achieving our tryst with destiny. Hence, I thought it was most appropriate, since this is a channel that focuses on public policy, to start in the midst of the election season, which is going to be responsible for electing our representatives who will ultimately form the government, which is the fountainhead of policy here. Now, this is an interesting comic that I came across. We ultimately live at the intersection of a state, market, and society. And the government is just the temporary holder of the seat of the state. As discussed in the previous slide, in the election season, we vote for our representatives who bases their majority or the parties or alliances that they are a part of will form a government. And these governments, because they are a part of democracy, enjoy legitimacy only as long as we approve. So the key takeaway here is the government is a temporary holder of the seat of the state. The state is a permanent entity. So policy is linked intrinsically to governments, and governments are temporary holders of the seat of the state. And hence, we need to understand what is the role of the state for us to be able to understand public policy a lot better. I would start this particular episode by taking a look at the police services and specifically the state capacity required to be able to execute this well. You may ask why. Well, I've been reading 3 books of late: Accelerating India's Development by Karthik Muralidharan, In the Service of the Republic by Vijay Karanajesha, and We the Citizens, from where you've seen the cartoon that I had posted a few slides earlier. All these books talk of the state, and 2 of the 3 books specifically talk of state capacity. So I thought, since policy is linked to government is the holder of the seat of the state and in discussing state capacity, why not talk of the police, which is the most visible arm of the state? And very recently, my wife had to get her passport renewed, and we had the police come and complete the verification process. So this is that one arm of the state that we as upper middle class citizens deal the most with, and they are the most visible part, with them providing services such as passport verification to protecting politicians that ultimately will occupy key spaces in the policy architecture. So in summary, this video will talk of the state capacity of the police force and the current lacunae that the police force face and what needs to be done in order to have a more effective police force. Now, in order to be able to understand this a lot better, we need to understand the role of the state, and that is what I started with. Now, let's look at what the role of the state is. Irrespective of the nature of the polity, we are a democratic polity, but maintenance of public order is universally recognized as the prime function of the state. Public order implies absence of disturbance, riot, revolt, unruliness, and lawlessness. So, this is the prime function of the state, and this has been stated in the Second Administrative Reforms Commission. Now, if you were to take a look at Indic literature and you were to look at the Arthashastra, there again we see that the role of the king, who analogous to the government of today, was expected to ensure the safety and security and punish people with anarchic tendencies. And once again we see the purpose of this was to maintain individual and social order. So maintenance of public order, as mentioned in the Second Administrative Reform Commission report. In the Arthashastra we see individual and social order. Now, one of the books that I was reading, as mentioned, was Accelerating India's Development of Practical Modernism. It talks of the role of the state and how it's evolved. Even here, we see that the first state was essentially a security state whose focus was on external defense and internal law and order. This then moved to the second phase post-industrial revolution, where states started investing in infrastructure, roads, railways, ports, sanitation, and sewage systems. And finally, we had the state where we got in the welfare state. But here again, the state's primary responsibility was external defense and law and order. So as we can see from multiple sources, the state primary role is the maintenance of order. And how the state achieves this is through the criminal justice system. Criminal justice system is the process that the state employs to protect the life and liberty of its citizens. This criminal justice system consists of essentially the police force, the prison system, and the courts. And what we would be looking at today in this video is essentially the police force. Now, to be able to do this a little better, and since we've talked about the criminal justice system, which is the process by which we maintain law and order, which is the prime function of the state, we need to understand the drivers of crime which impinge on the individual rights of citizens and lead to a violation of public order. So, the criminal justice system is founded on deterrence. Now, what is deterrence? Deterrence is the theory that criminal penalties not only punish those who broken the law, that is essentially violators, but this process also discourages people from committing similar offenses. So the entire system that exists seeks not just to punish those who violate the law, but also deter or prevent other individuals from carrying out such crimes which vitiate the maintenance of public order. The components of deterrence are A, certainty, severity, and celerity. So, what are these three terms? Well, certainty implies the probability that an individual who's committed the crime will be caught. Severity is the length of punishment, which is most often discussed when we have heinous crimes on the news. And celerity is the speed at which we carry out the said punishment. So these three are foundations of the criminal justice system, which is based on deterrence. So deterrence is a new idea. It's an old idea that has been discussed in academic writing right from Adam Smith all the way to Cesar Beccaria in 1764. Right? However, this was put formally in a model by Nobel Prize-winning economist Gary Becker in 1968 in his seminal paper Crime and Punishment. The paper essentially looks to model the drivers of crime, and at the heart of the paper is the notion that an individual who commits a crime will only do so if the benefits from that crime exceed the costs associated with it. Now, let me give you an example. Let's assume there is a car, pardon the dollars, this is an example which I had taken from a US paper, but let's assume there is a car which costs 40,000 rupees and there is an individual who seeks to carry out the crime, stealing the car and selling it for $40,000. Now, his or her income at the time of committing the crime is $60,000. So, if you were to just look at these two elements, you would say, why should you steal the car? You're already making $60,000. But there are two other components that come in. One is the probability that you'll be caught. His perceived or his or her perceived probability of being arrested and then being convicted. So in this case, it is 20% and 50% respectively for arrest and conviction. And then the number of years that you have to let go of that income. So in this case, the benefit is $40,000, but the perceived costs are $60,000, which is his income, multiplied by 5 years, which is essentially $300,000, which would have made for those 5 years had he not been or she not been convicted, multiplied by the probability of arrest and then conviction. In this case, this comes out to $30,000, and hence, when this is true, the crime is likely to take place. This is essentially what Gary Becker proposed in his paper, which tries to model crime using benefits and costs, and uses costs by bringing into consideration the probability of arrest and conviction along with sentencing. As you can see, you will start to be able to draw parallels with the components of deterrence that we discussed, which is certainty, which is essentially the probability of arrest, celerity, which is the speed and the certainty of conviction, and finally the duration, which is mentioned here. So the three components that we talked of in deterrence was put together in this model by Gary Becker, and you see an example here which can be used to be able to compute the costs. However, there are some limitations. One of the limitations of Gary Becker's model is that it assumes criminals are rational decision makers. And crime is a chosen activity. Crime rates can solely be reduced by decreasing the benefits associated with crime. That is essentially the benefits have to be lower than the cost, and hence by just increasing the benefits associated with work or the cost of opportunity, you'll be able to reduce crime. Now, this is not necessarily true since not all crimes are done by rational individuals. You have crimes of passion, such as revenge, which does not allow the individual to compute the potential costs associated with the crime. And it is also not possible for many times for an individual to be able to accurately gauge what the probability of arrest, conviction, or duration is. Because a lot of people may not even be aware of the laws and the sentencing periods, nor would they be able to assess accurately what the probability of arrest and conviction are. And many times it is not even possible to assess the net gain of the activity. So these are limitations. Nonetheless, it is still an effective model to be able to help us understand the criminal justice system and the drivers of crime, and for us to be able to use these inputs and the components of deterrence to design subsequent public policy. Now you may ask, how is all this linked to the police force? Very simple. The police, through the preventive parts of their role, along with effective investigation, prosecution, are responsible for increasing the perceived probability of getting caught and increasing the probability of conviction. It is only when the criminal believes that they are likely to be caught that crime will reduce basis the model that Becker proposed. And this is the heart of what we're going to be talking of today, and what role the police plays in increasing the probability of arrest and conviction, and today what are the opportunities of the police force. So if I were to summarize, the state is a permanent entity, the government occupies a temporary seat of the state, and they're responsible primarily for policy decisions. We were talking about the police force, which is essentially the most visible aspect of the state, and the primary duty of the state is to ensure the maintenance of order. This is done by the criminal justice system. An integral component of the criminal justice system is the police, and the role of the police bases the Beckerian model is to ensure that the probability of arrest and conviction are high, so that the costs always exceed the benefits, which subsequently reduces crime, which allows us to maintain public order. So I hope I've been able to draw the causal link between the role of the state, the role of the police in the criminal justice system, and finally the probability of arrest and conviction. As stated earlier, the criminal justice system is responsible for the probability of being caught, the probability of being prosecuted and executing the time spent in jail by the prison system. And the police specifically is responsible for the probability of being caught and being prosecuted by a proper investigation. There are several other methods to increase the probability of being caught. It is not just the police force that does it, and what you see here was taken from the College of Policing UK, a think tank that provides services to the police force across the European Union and the UK. So here you can see that CCTVs are a very effective way to increase the perceived probability of being caught, so is street lighting, speed cameras, and several other measures that include neighborhood watches as well. Here again, basis their empirical study, firearm laws, strict firearm laws are not very effective at reducing crime, and hence, apart from just the police force, you have certain other measures that can also increase the probability of being caught. This was just to give you an overview of the roles that the police force play and the other ways in which we can create an environment where crime is lower and the role of the state is indeed met. Now let's take a look at the Indian police force, right? Now the Indian police force consists of the state and central police force. The state police force's primary role is crime prevention and investigation and maintaining law and order, while the central forces are to be used in case of intense security challenges such as Maoism, terrorism, large-scale riots. It's important to remember that public order and police are state subjects, wherein the states will be responsible for the execution of the roles mentioned by the state police force, and hence here the state governments play a far more important role in carrying out the duties of the state. And this is your typical police structure. You've got a police district, which is essentially an area declared by the state government, which is the functional unit of police administration. The in charge of the police district is generally a superintendent of police and has operational independence in matters relating to internal management of the force and carrying out law and order duties. You've then got a police station, which is the basic building block of this administrative unit. It is headed by an inspector or sub-inspector and is responsible for the registration of crimes, local patrolling, investigation, handling of various law and order situations, intelligence collection, and ensuring safety and security in its jurisdiction. Now, a police station may have several outposts, but this is important for us to remember because this will serve as the bedrock of us evaluating the police force and its strength. So I hope you have been able to understand so far that the police force has two components, state and central. A state subject primarily, you've got a police district which is headed by an SP, and you've got a police station which is the basic unit of police function headed by an inspector or a sub-inspector. Now when we look at the roles and responsibilities, you would clearly see, and this is taken from the Model Police Act 2006, you clearly see at the outset it is to promote and preserve public order. And remember, this is the primary function of the state, and the police force are responsible for ensuring that the state carries this out. They also play a role in preventing crime, wherein they deter individuals from committing crime because the perceived probability of being arrested and subsequently convicted through a proper investigation will be high. So the role of the police, as stated in earlier slides, is to ensure deterrence, and in case a crime is committed, to ensure a thorough investigation and get the individual convicted. Right, you can go through this, it's been kept on your screen for some time, but in toto it captures the key roles that the police play in our day-to-day lives. Now essentially what I'm trying to do is to be able to understand the efficacy of the police force. There has to be a model, and this model requires us to evaluate the police force on its key functions. And at the outset you've got to preserve and promote public order, but you've also got several other functions which you saw in the previous slide. Now if we had to bucket them you've got 7 key functions or 7 key buckets that we can put their functions into. One is to reduce crime and victimization. Two is to get the offenders to account or ensure that they're arrested and convicted. 3, to reduce fear and enhance personal security. 4, ensure civility in public spaces. 5, to use their force and authority fairly, efficiently, and effectively, and then to do this using financial resources fairly, efficiently, and effectively, and to ensure that ultimately the citizen is satisfied with the services. Now, this framework was borrowed from the bottom line of policing: what citizens should value and measure in the police performance. So to be able to evaluate the police force, we need to clearly understand what their functions are. So that's been understood and that's been bucketed into these 7 points, because it is on the basis of this that we will judge or evaluate the Indian police force today. Right? This is an approach which I am taking. This is, I think, a unique way to do so. There are several papers that have done this using one or two of these metrics, but what I'm trying to do is bring this all together to provide a holistic assessment of the Indian police force, and we'll be doing this using these 7 criteria and the data that is available in the public domain. And the reason for doing this is very clear. It is possible for us to suggest improvements if we know where we lie today, and we then measure those elements and set a benchmark against which we will clearly identify what does it take to move the needle and what needs to be done to ensure that we continue on this path to constant improvement. So this is essentially the framework that we had seen 2 slides back. What I've tried to do is create a metric for each of the 7 buckets. Example, if we were to talk of reduced crime and victimization, what we would essentially be talking of is the crime rate. And what victimization essentially refers to is, since all crimes are not recorded, there are several instances where when crime is committed, the individual does not come forth and register a case. Hence, for every crime that is recorded or an FIR is filed and recorded in the national database, there are several others which do not even reach the police station. So that is essentially what a victimization survey does. It is able to give you a holistic assessment of the true crime rate, and the objective of the police force is obviously to keep reducing crime rates and reduce victimization scores as years go by. When we talk of calling offenders to account, we'll be using conviction rate, which is, it is only possible to convict an individual if you carry out a proper investigation, and hence it's firmly within the domain of what the police is supposed to do. So reducing crime rates, reducing victimization scores, increasing conviction rates, reducing crime rates in public spaces. And when you talk of using force fairly and efficiently, we'll talk of whether police complaints and corruption cases have been on the decline and whether there have been custodial deaths. And these are indications of them not using their force fairly. So these are metrics that I've decided. Again, financial resources is, we will be looking at whether the police productivity here specifically is the output with the financial resources improving year on year. And then finally, is the citizen satisfied with the services that the police provide? So these are the metrics that I decided will be used to be able to assess the Indian police force today. These metrics were decided prior to even going and collecting data, and I had decided that this was the criteria that I was going to use, and I did not get into the data because I didn't want to be biased. So this metric and framework was decided prior to collecting data. And now when we get each of these elements, now let's start with reduced crime and victimization. When we look at crime rates, we see that overall crime rates have been stable and there's been no observed rise. And when we ask for total crime rates, which include even unreported crimes, this is where I mentioned victimization surveys come into play. Unfortunately, we don't have victimization surveys carried out on a regular basis for us to be able to understand what the true crime rates are. So if you were to look at crime rates, which are recorded crimes, you see that there is no increase over the last 20 years. And when we try and understand to what extent do crimes go unreported, we have data which says that 40% of only all crimes are reported to the police. It is even lower in developing countries and varies by crime. Essentially, it is very low for sexual assault but much higher for murder. So we know that there are certain crimes for which reporting is very low. Hence, the crime rates that we see are not necessarily the best way to gauge the effectiveness of the police force, because as I mentioned, one of the key roles and responsibilities of the police is to ensure that crime rates reduce. We see in India the crime rates have been stable, but since there is no data on victimization, we cannot state whether indeed total crime rates, reported and unreported, are indeed on the decline. So what we would then do is try and look at those crimes where globally basis studies carried out, we know that underreporting is unlikely, and this is most likely crimes, right? And this is just an extent of underreporting basis two independent studies, which is essentially the Jalpaiguri experiment and a paper put out by Abhijit and Esther Duflo. We see that the number of crimes which are unreported is roughly 4x the number of crimes reported. So this is just to tell you that 1 out of every 5 crimes is what we record, and hence without knowing the extent of over-reporting or under-reporting, we are unable to gauge the true picture. So we now get into serious crimes which have a tendency, based on global studies, to be less underreported, or the total crimes as recorded is more often than not as close to the true crimes for serious elements, right? And when we start to look at serious crimes, we actually see that there has been a decline. There has been a decline for murder, riot, robbery, theft, and burglary. This is India specific, and we've seen a clear decline. Now there is a global decline as well, and I'll try and get into why there is a global decline along with an Indian decline at the same time. Are there any global factors that were responsible for this decline? But we clearly see that there is a decline in serious crime rates from the 70s. The only serious crime which has been on the rise is rape, and this is on account of increased reporting and increased female education awareness campaigns. So excluding rape, murder and robbery have clearly seen a decline from the 70s onwards. So here, on account of serious crimes, we definitely should give the police its credit, and there has been a decline. So the police has been able to reduce the extent of serious crimes over the last 50 years. So I think we've done a reasonable job here. I want to take the second element, which is conviction rates. This is obviously a concern. So on element 1, which is crime rates, unfortunately, we don't have victimization surveys to be able to assess whether true crime rates, which is reported plus unreported, is on the decline. But when we look at serious crime rates, we see that serious crime rates, with the exception of rape, is on the decline over the last 50 years. So here the police has definitely been able to carry out one key function. However, we look at conviction rates, which is essentially an indication of how well an investigation has been carried out. We see that there has been a declining conviction rate, and this indicates partly worsening investigation. It also could indicate insufficient prosecutorial capacity, because even if you've done a great investigation, if the prosecutor is not effective, it's unlikely that the individual who's committed the crime is going to be convicted. It could also be that there is insufficient judicial capacity because you've got over 3 crore pending cases, and hence the judge may not have been able to give his or her full attention to the case, and hence it is unlikely that declining conviction rates solely fall on the police, but it is a factor. So on this front, unfortunately, the police hasn't been improving year on year. We clearly see a secular decline from the 1960s onwards. Now, when we talk of fair use of force, the metric that I had decided was the number of police complaints and custodial deaths. Now, when you look at custodial deaths, is definitely been an increase. And what's far more concerning is that over the last 6 years, only one officer has had a departmental action initiated against him or her. So on this metric, we are definitely getting worse off, and there is no departmental action that has been initiated over the last 6 years against any officer that was responsible for custodial death. Now, it may not have been individuals. Problem that a suspect died in police custody, but the fact that 0 officers have been prosecuted and 0 departmental action being initiated is indeed troubling. Now, the probability of this is very low, but this is the situation, and hence I think on this metric Indian police force doesn't score very. Now, on the efficient use of resources, there is very limited literature available out here, and at best what we've got is a comparison among states. It is not possible for us to be able to state, basis the literature out there today, whether the Indian police force is efficient or not with the resources available. We've got an intrastate comparison, but we do not have any study which can state with absolute certainty whether the police force, which is the combination of all states, is efficient or not. And this is specifically on the use of financial resources. Now, said, how satisfied is the citizen? And the proxy that I've used is a survey that was carried out by CSDS, Common Cause and Tata Trust, and it was mentioned in the status of policing report. Here again, we do not have trends, and ideally that is what we should be using, since these are not carried out by government or quasi-government bodies or constitutional authorities on a regular basis. Using a point-in-time measure is definitely not good, but this is the best we've got. And what you see is that the trust, when you look at the data, what you see basis the results put in front of you, is that the trust in the police officer is a lot lower than the trust in the army or the courts. It's slightly higher than the trust in the government officers, but for me, area of concern is the sheer delta that exists between a lot of trust in the police officer and a trust in army. And this is percentage of respondents who stated that they have a lot of trust. The sheer gap between these two institutions is a cause of concern, but since we do not have trends, I cannot make any statement on whether this is improving or worsening over time. But this is definitely an opportunity in my mind. The sheer gap that exists between two institutions that are responsible for the maintenance of public order. One is internal, which is police, then you've got the army, which is responsible for maintaining our borders, and external order. And now, from the same report, when we look at what percentage of the respondents who've interacted with the police are satisfied, we see that 20 odd percentage is fully satisfied with the services that's been provided. Again, this is a point in time measure. It is concerning that the measure is so low since we do not have a trend over time. The point in time measure, which is 1/4 of all respondents who've had or who've received police services are only fully or very satisfied, is concerning, right? This, along with the earlier slide on the percentage of respondents who trust the local police officer and the gap that exists with the army, should point us towards this being definitely an opportunity, right? So finally, when I put this together, and I've tried to color code it with green being above par, yellow being inconclusive, red being below par, and black being I don't have the data to be able to definitively state whether it's green, yellow, or red. On reducing crime, we definitely see that they score a green on reducing crime, but since we don't have victimization score, it is no data, and hence the net color I've given is yellow because inconclusive without reducing victimization scores. Increasing conviction rate, as we see, is a falling falling conviction rate, so hence they score a red. Once again, when we have reducing crime in public spaces, because we don't have data at that granularity, I've said it's a black. Reduced police complaints, I could not find any data which could track the trends over time. Non-custodial deaths, basis what I've shown you all, where custodial deaths are on the rise, but zero departmental action has been taken so far against any of the last 6 years. I've scored it as a red. Now on productivity and increasing satisfaction scores, as I said, productivity rates, this is again financial productivity, we do not, with limited literature available out there. And on citizen satisfaction scores, well, a point in time measure, that is the status of India policing report, shows that there's an opportunity, but since we do not have trends over time, I've said data is inconclusive. Overall, net basis all the data that we've been able to accumulate, I would say that the police force is par, with a lot of this being inconclusive. So one key next step for us to be able to gauge or measure the efficacy of the police force is the collection of not just crime data but victimization data, police complaints, and having all this put together by a constitutional authority. If it has to be done on an annual basis by the Standing Committee on Home Affairs, or if it has to be done by the Law Commission, or we have to set up another institution that is just responsible for the evaluation of the police force on an annual or a biannual basis, that's definitely something that we need to do. And this has been suggested even by Karthik Muralidharan, wherein we are a data deficient state and hence we are not able to make a lot of decisions on institutional basis without data. Hence data collection is necessary. But basis what we have so far, I would say the result is inconclusive. And a key next step, which you will see in part 2 of the video, is the recommendation of setting up a body, if not by existing bodies, to be able to do this analysis on a frequent basis, annual, biannual. The government of the day can decide, but this needs to be done. And the framework that I've used here is a framework that I've developed. Experts who work in this field need to do something very similar via the constitutional body that needs to be set up, or via existing bodies such as the Standing Committee on Home Affairs or the Law Commission. Right, since the data was inconclusive and we were not able to clearly point to opportunities based on the framework that I had used, let's look at what the experts have told us about the opportunities that the Indian Police Force has. And you've had multiple committees, right from the National Police Commission, which was set up in 1977, to the Police Act Drafting Committee in 2015. Now, with regards to police reforms, a key document that is cited time and time again is the Supreme Court judgment in Prakash Singh versus Union of India. So that again we will go through in the subsequent slides. But this is essentially what I've decided I will use now, since I do not have sufficient data to be able to determine clearly what are the deficiencies in the Indian police. Now, when we look at it, one clear element that emerges is police need greater operational freedom, right? And this has been cited time and time again, including the Second Administrative Reforms Commission. They've also talked of setting up an independence complaint authority. As I said, one of the key factors in the 7 criteria was the use of force fairly. One of the criteria used was police complaints, and as I stated, I do not have any data, and one of the recommendations that has come up, including in the Prakash Singh judgment, is to set up an independent complaints authority. So this is another suggestion that has come through, which I definitely endorse, because at least it would result in the creation of a data bank which can then be used to assess the police force more holistically and in a more timely manner. Then you've also got the Second Administrative Reforms Commission, which talks of the constables and the working conditions of the constables and how their promotion opportunities are minimal, since the bulk of the force, that is 8 out of the 10 police personnel, are constables, and how their working conditions need to be improved. So we've had 3 key suggestions so far. One deals with greater operational autonomy for the police. Number 2 deals with the setting up of an independence complaints authority. Number 3 deals with the working conditions of the constabulary and their promotions, along with housing. Then you've also got suggestions which ask for crime investigation to be separated from the police force, that is to clearly remove this from the duties of the police station, to set up a force which is trained in crime investigation. Theoretically, this makes sense because this would ideally lead to higher conviction rates, because we clearly see that one of the reasons for lower conviction rates is poor investigation practices over time. So this is definitely a suggestion that has come through in multiple reports, which has asked for the separation of law and order and investigation. Then you've also got suggestions on police infrastructure, which states that the infrastructure present is insufficient or inadequate, and some of the infrastructure provided, specifically guns, communication equipment, is outdated, and hence the police cannot carry out their duties in accordance with what has been mentioned. So we've now seen what the experts have stated on what needs to be done to improve the police force. Now let's listen to what the policemen themselves have to state. Right? And this again was taken from the Status of Policing Report 2019. The one thing which clearly emerges is policemen themselves say that we need to increase the number of staff in the police, and this ties in with essentially sufficient infrastructure not being present, and that includes manpower as well. So this is a suggestion that comes through very clearly, but this is what policemen themselves have to state, and this also talks of greater autonomy, increasing the number of police stations, more facilities, fixed working time, and talks of CCTV cameras. As we discussed earlier, that is a tool which will assist in investigation while also increasing the probability of detection, and better training. Again, this is a summary of this, wherein policemen have been asked on what suggestion they thought would be most useful, and you can clearly see increasing the number of policemen comes out here once again, along with CCTV, street lighting, and improving their network of compromise. Now, they believe that one of the key reasons that is holding them back is their workload is far too high, there's a lack of time, they do not have enough resources, there's a lack of training, there's a lack of money for investigation, there's not sufficient staff, spy network is weak, they're unable to catch hold of a culprit, there is political pressure, there's pressure from rich and influential people, there's pressure from media. You can see a load of reasons that the police themselves have stated for what needs to be done in order to get better. So now when I summarize, we've clearly seen that the primary role of the state is public order. is the protection and maintenance of public order. Then we see that the police is responsible for this. This should be done while considering the overall deterrence model, where probability of arrest, conviction, and duration is key. And now we looked at, since the police is responsible for the probability of arrest and conviction, how exactly should we evaluate the police? I had put in a framework with 7 key elements, of which data was not available for 4 out of 7, and in the 3 we clearly saw that on crime rates, specifically serious crime rates with the exception of rape, there's been a decline over the last 50 years. So on that element we are definitely doing what is required, and when I mean we, I'm referring to the police force. However, on conviction rates we've seen a decline, and this partly is on account of poorer investigation. But overall, on the 7 key criteria and data points, I would say insufficient data, and hence it is not conclusive. So we then looked at what several committees have said in the past, and we see greater operational autonomy, the condition of the constabulary. We then talk of sufficient, or rather insufficient infrastructure, and separating investigation from law and order duties. Then when we asked the policemen themselves, they clearly stated that increasing the number of police officers, infrastructure, preventing political pressure is important for them to be able to do their job better. Now, putting all this together within a framework is important before we suggest solutions. So I'll stop my video here. I hope you all learned something new. Please do let me know in case you have any doubts, inputs, and whether you found the frameworks that I've proposed useful, and whether what you've seen on screen is actually contributing to the discussion on improving the police force and system. Again, this is part 1. In part 2 we'll talk or bring all this together that we've seen within a framework and potential solutions. Thank you.